Welcome everybody. Today we have a special, very special privilege to be here with one of my colleagues, Dr. Belay Seyoum, who is the author of this textbook on import-export theories and concepts and practices, which now is in its third edition. It's one of the textbooks that's basically being used in all continents, in many universities throughout the world. So it's probably the top textbook on export imports being used. And today we get to learn a little bit directly from the author. So today we have, again, this very nice privilege of actually meeting with Dr. Belay Seyoum. He's going to share some of his insights with us. So Dr. Belay Seyoum, thank you for being here. We appreciate it. I want to ask you a few questions so you can share your insights with our audience all over the world. Dr. Seyoum, would you give us a little bit of your biography, your background, basically what countries, what continents, what schools you've been to, and basically provide us a little bit more insights about your background, your biography?
Yes, I was born in Ethiopia, East Africa. In terms of education, I did my undergraduate education in Africa and later received a scholarship to study in Canada, to do my graduate studies in Canada. And in Canada, I completed my master's and my doctoral degree at McGill University in Montreal with specialization in international business and international business law. After completing my studies, I taught at Concordia University as well as McGill University in Montreal, Canada, before moving to Nova Southeastern University in Florida. I have been teaching at Nova Southeastern University for the last 2 decades. I have also taught international business as a visiting professor in Colombia, Taiwan, and Thailand.
You also had a sabbatical in Poland. How long ago was that, and how was that experience, a Fulbright trip?
Yeah, I won the Fulbright Fellowship in 2007, and given the opportunity by the U.S. government to teach in Poland. And I taught at the University of Warsaw in Poland in 2007, in the winter of 2007, which was a very enjoyable experience, and it was wonderful.
Very good. It's a privilege to have you here explaining to our students a little bit about import-export, and we appreciate it. You're one of the main authors on import-exports, or the theories of export, import, and practices. Your book is being used in many different countries around the globe, probably in all continents. Tell us a little bit about why you wrote this book, and obviously how it is helping researchers, students, and obviously entrepreneurs who are involved in import-export.
In the 1990s, I was often assigned to teach a course in import-export at different universities. I quickly realized that the existing textbooks were inadequate to meet the needs of an academic audience. Most of them were trade books with a soft coverage of international trade. And at the same time, they were exclusively devoted to exports. Many of them did not even cover imports. So I actually embarked on the idea of writing an academic textbook on import-export. And I would probably say that this is probably the first textbook with an academic audience in mind. Now, the purpose of this book probably will be about maybe 2 or 3, and I would say the first one is to provide a comprehensive and analytical treatment of export-import processes and activities. The second one, which actually most of the textbooks lacked, was to provide a conceptual and theoretical framework for export-import activities. Most books never had any conceptual issues discussed in those books. And then the third one is also to provide adequate coverage of emerging issues in international trade. For example, the role of intellectual property rights in international trade, issues relating to countertrade, regional trade agreements, logistics and transportation, and so on. So in terms of suitability of the book, I would say that the book would be quite suitable for students specializing in international business, entrepreneurship, and it will be also good for graduate programs or senior undergraduate levels as well.
Would you give us a little bit of your view on international trade, as well as your definition or view of closed economies versus open economies in today's modern environment?
International trade is the exchange of goods and services across national boundaries. And it's the most traditional form of international business activity. And so in a way, trade has played a major role in world history. Now, it's in terms of open and closed economies, countries that are open economies tend to have vibrant international trade activity. Now, countries with closed economies have some trade because they need to buy certain things for their consumers. But trade would not be as vibrant. It would not be as dynamic as in open economies.
What is the purpose of export, and why should a country be involved in exports? And
if you look at international trade, you have to divide them into two big categories. One is exports, and the other one is imports. Now, with regard to exports, countries export products or services in which they have a comparative advantage. For example, if you look at countries like Brazil or Ivory Coast in Africa, and some of those countries, their comparative advantage is in the production of products like coffee. And so comparative advantage is probably one of the driving forces behind export trade. Now, if you look at imports, of course, why countries import? Because a couple of reasons. One is they don't have the products that they need, or the products that they need, even if they are available in the domestic market, may be too expensive, so they import those products. So those are the reasons why countries basically have import, export, or basically have international trade. Now, in terms of businesses, why businesses export, why businesses import, is also another interesting question. Why businesses export is because in many countries, the market may not be that big for a given product. So they would like to expand their market, which means that they will have more sales. Okay, and also they make more profit as you expand your market and you sell more products or goods or services. Your profit margin goes up. So that's what actually drives companies to export. Now, in terms of imports, of course, it's the same factor. Sometimes manufacturing costs may be too high for companies if they buy domestic products. So they would like to buy foreign products to reduce their manufacturing cost. And sometimes also, if they find a unique product overseas, they could buy it for the consumer. So that those are some of the reasons. So you have to look at it in terms of why governments allow for import-export, and why companies also do export-import. So those are the kind of two things you have to look at: governments as well as companies.
In your view, should policymakers at the government level be involved in this balance between import and export for their specific countries? So, what are your views on deficits and obviously this balance regarding imports and exports?
Exports are important for national economies, and that's why most governments promote exports. I think a couple of reasons. One is that exports create jobs. If you look at most countries, export actually create, sometimes millions of jobs in the domestic economy. Now, secondly, exports also support high job, in other words, higher wages. Many studies indicate that workers that people working in export industries actually get 25% to 30% higher wages than those who work in domestic industries. So they do support higher wages. That is another important benefit of exporting. And I think another important benefit is, especially for most developing countries, exports do help them generate foreign currencies. And so the foreign currency will support the domestic economy. The more foreign currency a country has, they can be able to reduce inflation through monetary policy. So that monetary policy becomes difficult to manage if you don't have sufficient reserves, foreign currency reserves. So that exports helps a country to be able to get that foreign currency that's needed.
So, what is your view regarding balance between imports and exports, and what considerations should policymakers look into to create a balance, or is that really not critical in your view?
Export-import should be looked at in terms of balance of trade, so that when a country exports more than it imports, then that country has a trade surplus. Now, when a country imports more than it exports, then it has a trade deficit. Okay. Now, what is the global situation with regard to trade surplus and trade deficits? I think probably about 90% of the world today has a trade deficit problem. In other words, they buy more than they sell to the rest of the global economy. Very few countries have a trade surplus. For example, Japan, China, maybe Saudi Arabia, Russia, and maybe a few countries like that. So less than a dozen countries have a trade surplus. Now, so it becomes actually, there's what you call a widespread trade imbalance in the global economy now. And it's persistent over time. It does not go down. It just keeps on going up every year, and so that's a major problem. Now, how does that impact these economies? Well, the problem is that these persistent trade deficits push up the debt level, and so countries end up with very high debt loads, and for some countries, it amounts to over 100% of their GDP, and so that becomes insurmountable. It's not sustainable in the long term, because it's high debt is not good for national economies. So that is the issue with trade balances. So what they need to do, it needs a long-term strategy to balance export-import. One is governments and businesses have to work together to make sure that export is promoted. So there is a need to promote exports in many ways. We'll be discussing that in a minute, but I think the solution is basically not reducing imports, but promoting exports. Because reducing import has its own negative consequences, because exporters also need to buy goods and services so that they become more efficient. So that I think the solution is not reducing import. I think the solution is actually to promote exports as much as possible, so that countries can be able to reduce the trade deficit. an important issue that needs to be underlined is that firms export, governments don't export. Therefore, governments have to encourage businesses or firms to export to the global economy. So it's a question of actually having the appropriate policies, government policies, to help the companies to be able to export. And so that needs, a kind of collaboration between the private sector and the government, which is the public sector. And I think that's how many countries have done in terms of promoting export. Japan is a very good example. The Japanese government, for the last 30 years or so, has worked with the business community and essentially facilitating the export of Japanese products. So that's basically what they've done, including buying products from the private sector, so that they create more demand for those goods and services which are produced by Japanese businesses. So the government actually is the one that actually promotes it by buying those new products that come up. So this is where the governments have to play an important role to promote their exports to the rest of the global economy. Yes.
Is there a relationship between more or less regulations and a country's level of exports, let's say?
I think the question, most exporters would not like more regulations. More regulations actually create even more problems, because then it becomes a handicap in promoting export. So I think what they have to do is to cut down on regulations, cut down on corruption, for example, which is prevalent in most countries. Also provide various types of incentives, including tax incentives. Maybe they could give them different kind of benefits so that it reduces their cost, so that they can be competitive in the export market. It's most countries that have succeeded in having a trade balance or a trade surplus. They have actually done that through collaboration. Basically, the private sector cannot do it on its own, because they need the government to help them in terms of appropriate policies. For example, just to give you one example, one of the problems in some countries is export financing. Exporters need financing because they need the money before they are paid. Because when you export goods or services, you're not paid. You're not paid before maybe a couple of months. So you always export on credit. Export is not done on cash, basically on a cash basis or whatever. So it's basically done on credit. So during the time when they're waiting for that payment, they need some kind of bridge financing. And that's where the government comes in. And they said, okay, we will provide you the financing, you go ahead and export. And that will help them to be able to pay for raw materials, for inventory that they may keep, for labor, and so on and so forth. So those are the kind of things that governments can do.
What are some of the trends regarding imports and exports that we should look into, at least as researchers, as importers and exporters, or policymakers? Are there specific areas where we need to be concerned about?
What is a trend in terms of international trade today? Well, a couple of points can be made. One, the globalization process continues. There may be a certain level of gaps and recession and things of that nature that may slow it down. But the process for globalization, the growth in the volume of international trade will continue as countries integrate more and more into the global economy. So that's the first trend. The second issue that we see is that with more trade comes more friction. For example, countries with a trade deficit, like the United States, are taking notice that the country with the trade surplus should buy more from them, So this is now leading to trade wars. Just to give you an example, now we have almost a mini trade war between the United States and China, because China tends to sell more to the United States than it buys from the United States. So China has a trade surplus, and the United States has a trade deficit with China. As a matter of fact, if you look at US trade deficit with the rest of the world, half of it is with China. And so the US administration basically says that China has to buy more from the United States. And so they are putting all kinds of restrictions now on Chinese goods coming to the United States. So this is becoming the trend. There may be also a trade war between the United States and Europe, because particularly Germany has a trade surplus with the United States. We have a problem with Mexico, because Mexico has a trade surplus with the United States. And so it becomes a major problem, and that may have an impact on the smooth flow of export imports, unless it's tackled at the right time and with the right remedies. I don't feel that restricting imports from surplus countries would be the solution. I think what is important is to, again, work with the business community to increase exports from the United States. And at the same time also work with the business community, because the paradox of, for example, American trade deficit is that some of the American corporations are producing goods in Canada, Mexico, and China, and then exporting to the United States. So it's not really foreign companies; they are American companies exporting from those countries to the United States. So it's a question of working with the business community with the same American companies to see how this deficit can be reduced. So it's not a difficult problem, but it needs to be worked out carefully.
So in terms of trade wars, are there or can there be specific winners and losers if we have trade wars between developed countries and obviously all countries? Who wins and who loses ultimately?
With trade wars, it's a loss for the global economy, because once you have a trade war, we're going back to the times of the 1920s when trade shrunk by 30% or more, because every country was restricting imports, and they just wanted to export, but they didn't want to buy foreign imports to balance their trade. And the effect of that is reduced employment, and also there wouldn't be low-priced goods coming from foreign countries, so the consumer is worse off, because we get a lot of low-priced merchandise from the rest of the world. So if we restrict trade because of these trade wars, then the standard of living of the average consumer will go down, because they are not getting those goods that are low-priced, and so that also will be a problem. And at the same time, also, if you look at the economics of it, we will be more and more restricted to buying domestic merchandise, and some of it may be expensive, so the inflation rate may also go up. So in a nutshell, in trade wars, nobody's a winner, everybody's a loser. The idea of international trade is it's welfare benefit for the average consumer in the global economy. If China is making goods for the global economy, for example, for the US market, whether they are made by Chinese companies or not, it still benefits the American economy. Because when goods are coming from China and they are low-priced, good quality merchandise, who benefits from this? It's the American consumer. Now, if we don't do that and we want to restrict Chinese goods from coming in, first of all, there's a welfare loss for the consumer. Inflation rates will go up, which is not good for our economy. And also, American companies will not get the parts and raw material that they need from China, for example, because they we get also a lot of intermediate goods for manufacturing from China and many other countries. We would not be able to get them, so that manufacturing costs will be very high. So those are the kind of things that need to be considered before we undermine international trade.
Well, thank you very much for all these insights and thoughts, Dr. Belay Seyoum. We appreciate your time.
Thank you for inviting me.